You have probably heard the name Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the man who proclaimed himself the supreme leader of the self-proclaimed Islamic State, abbreviated as ISIS. Under his orders, tens of thousands of people were killed in Iraq and Syria. Thousands of innocent civilian communities were wiped off the map, and women and children were turned into victims of a regime of enslavement, abused and exploited in a systematic way. An anonymous village preacher suddenly became the face behind the black flags that haunted the entire world. What is frightening about Baghdadi is not only the scale of his crimes, but his influence. From a voice on an audio recording, he was able to draw young people from the Middle East, Europe, and America to leave their homes, leave their futures behind, and willingly come to live under his rule. With just one sermon, he could manipulate people's minds, turning resentment and a sense of abandonment into a kind of ideal they were ready to die for on his behalf. That is his most dangerous weapon, the ability to manipulate faith to justify crimes. So what was it about this man that made so many people believe he was a true religious leader, even though everything he built stood on the blood of innocent people and on calculated deceit? And how could someone whose background was merely that of a failed theology student become the emblem of supreme terrorist power in the early 21st century? In this video, we will retrace the path of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's life to understand why he was so dangerous and why the world cannot be allowed to forget the crimes he committed. Going back to the final years of the last century, when Samarra was still a small city on the banks of the Tigris River, famous for its spiral tower and Islamic holy sites, where religion was not only a belief but the rhythm of daily life. Baghdadi was born into a devout Sunni family. His relatives were connected to the local mosque, to teaching children how to recite scripture and maintaining religious discipline for the whole neighborhood. The familiar image of the boy at that time was not a gun or a black flag, but a child with glasses, quiet, sitting on a mat, mumbling Arabic verses under yellow light. In the memories of many Iraqis, he was the model of an obedient son, associated with the mosque more than with the streets. In the eyes of many Americans, every terrorist leader grows up in extreme poverty and violence. The reality is more complicated. Baghdadi was not wealthy, but he was not a street child either. He was able to go to school, had the opportunity to enter university, and chose the religious path because it was the only field in which he felt he stood out. After struggling to complete secondary school, he enrolled in Islamic law and subjects related to the Quran at an Islamic university in Baghdad, then went on to obtain higher degrees in the same field. On paper, it was a very ordinary path for a young man who wanted to become a cleric, a religious scholar, or a religious lecturer. There was no sign that this would be the man who would lead a global terrorist organization. He was not a military genius, not a political strategist. He was a product of a closed religious education system. In a society tightly controlled by the Saddam regime, where religion was both exploited and restricted. But his choice to use that knowledge to cloak violence in something sacred is a personal responsibility that cannot be shrugged off. From the perspective of someone living in a democracy, this is something worth reflecting on. For many years, Baghdadi was just a name in student records, on a list of people being trained to teach religion. But it was precisely that foundation, that knowledge, that prestige in the eyes of the local community that later became the tool he used to drape a sacred veil over violence. Before becoming a self-proclaimed head of state, he was just a boy from Samarra with a dream of becoming a religious scholar. And precisely because of that, his story is far more dangerous than the image of a purely violent figure that we often imagine. When he stepped out of the theology lecture halls in Baghdad in the late 1990s, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was not a name everyone knew. He was one of many young Iraqis holding a few degrees in Islamic law, dreaming of a modest seat in a local mosque. His world at that time revolved around books, prayers, and a dictatorial country that still had a degree of order. But shortly after that, the storm we call the Iraq War swept away what little order there was. From this side of the ocean, we Americans remember 2003 through images of cruise missiles, tanks rolling across the desert, and statues being pulled down in public squares. For many Iraqis, those memories are of a government collapsing in just a few weeks, state institutions closing, the army being disbanded, salaries disappearing, and Sunnis like Baghdadi's family suddenly falling from the center of power to the margins. The feelings of loss, humiliation, and powerlessness mix together into something very dangerous. In that context, people with religious knowledge like Baghdadi became valuable in a completely new way. They could explain humiliation in sacred language, turning political anger into a call for holy war. Instead of just teaching scripture to children, Baghdadi began to associate himself with more conservative preaching groups, then with small armed networks resisting foreign forces and the new government. On Iraq's streets, more roadside bombs, ambushes, and kidnappings appeared. While in prayer gatherings, stories of oppression and resistance were increasingly emphasized. This was the phase of radicalization that took place in silence. There was no single moment we can point to and say that he became a terrorist from that second on. Instead, there were hundreds of private conversations, dozens of new relationships, countless times he witnessed violence and no longer saw it as something unusual. A man familiar with the language of Scripture began quoting those words in an increasingly hardline way, increasingly dividing things into black and white. If this were a criminal file, we would have to mark this entire period with a series of bullet points. New relationships, increasingly hardline sermons, and the first time he regarded violence as normal. For Americans, this is the hardest part to accept. We viewed the invasion as a strategic act, a policy choice. But on the other side, the orders to dissolve the state apparatus, the loose raids, the hastily erected prisons turned thousands of young men like Baghdadi into fertile ground for extremist ideas. He did not suddenly wake up and decide to build a terrorist state. He slid down step by step, from lecture hall to mosque, from mosque to armed group, from armed group into the vortex of war that we also helped create. And it was within that vortex that the doors leading to prison and to fateful encounters opened for him. When it comes to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, many researchers call Camp Bucca a terrorist university. But to understand why, we need to look at a few very cold points in time. In early February 2004, just 1 year after the U.S. entered Iraq, Baghdadi was captured near Fallujah by U.S. forces as an individual connected to terrorist activity. He was registered under his real name, Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim al-Badri, taken through Abu Ghraib, and then transferred down to the Camp Bucca detention facility in southern Iraq, and classified as a low-level civilian detainee. Pentagon records show that he was released on December 8, 2004, although many later articles mistakenly claimed that he was held until 2009. At that time, Camp Bucca was holding more than 20,000 Iraqis, many of them former officers, operatives of extremist groups, and of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq network. In principle, this was a place to separate dangerous people from society. But in reality, we placed thousands of angry, humiliated people with military skills and religious backgrounds into the same cramped space with no reintegration or dialogue programs. In that environment, people like Baghdadi, with religious degrees, a soft-spoken manner, and knowledge of the Quran by heart, suddenly became prison clerics, the ones who led prayers, explained scripture, and connected groups of inmates. We can easily see that this was where we inadvertently created favorable conditions by gathering the most extreme, most organized people into a single camp, then letting them spend months, even years, talking, recruiting, and building mutual trust. Officers who had once commanded Saddam's units, al-Qaeda operatives, newly radicalized young men, all met, exchanged contact information, aligned their views, and began to imagine a big project for after they were released. Camp Bucca was not only a place of detention, but the place where the future network of an organization like the Islamic State was woven, knot by knot. Baghdadi entered Bucca as a mid-level extremist, both a cleric and a rebel. He came out with something far more dangerous: prestige in the eyes of other prisoners and an address book full of names with battlefield experience. When we rated him as a low threat and sent him home, we did not see what was taking shape right in the yard of our own prison camp. From a prison built to weaken the jihadist movement, Camp Bucca inadvertently became a launchpad. A leap in rank that turned Baghdadi from a failed preacher into a core leader for the next generation of terrorists. And that is a lesson the United States is forced to remember whenever it speaks about war, detention, and the long-term cost of security decisions that seem very short-term. After Camp Bucca, the story of Baghdadi was no longer just about an extremist individual. He began to move into the center of a network that was growing out of the ruins of Iraq. In 2010, after many leaders of the organization Islamic State of Iraq were eliminated, Baghdadi was chosen as the head. On paper, this was still only an insurgent group in Iraq. But in his mind, the idea was different. He did not want to continue being a franchise of al-Qaeda. He wanted something bigger, a real state, with territory, taxes, police, courts, an army, and a caliph standing above all. The opportunity came when civil war broke out in Syria in 2011. The border between Iraq and Syria looks straight and clear on the world map, but on the ground it is very porous. Weapons, fighters, money, and ideas moved back and forth as if there had never been a border. Baghdadi sent men into Syria to set up a new branch, and in 2013, he officially renamed the organization the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, that is, ISIS or ISIL. While al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan tried to maintain the model of striking the far enemy, Baghdadi chose a different path. He seized land, seized cities, drew borders, and proclaimed himself the center of a new caliphate. 2014 was the turning point. In just a few months, the group's fighters captured a string of towns in northern Iraq. On June 10, 2014, the world saw something few thought possible. The city of Mosul, with up to 1 million inhabitants, fell into the hands of ISIS forces. An entire Iraqi army division collapsed. US weapons were left behind in barracks. Banks were smashed open. And hundreds of millions of dollars in cash fell into their hands. An organization that many in Washington had once considered a remnant suddenly had tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, ammunition depots, and a major city to rule. From an objective perspective, this was the moment when we truly realized the extent to which a terrorist state could go. In June and July 2014, the group not only held Mosul, but also swept across vast areas of northern and western Iraq and northern and eastern Syria. They controlled oil fields, roads, and strategic bridges. And then, on June 29, 2014, they declared the establishment of the Islamic State. dropping the Iraq and al-Sham part from the name, implying global ambitions. The iconic image was the sermon at the Al-Nuri Mosque in Mosul in early July 2014. For the first time, and almost the only time, Baghdadi appeared openly on camera, wearing a black robe and black turban, stepping onto the stone pulpit of an ancient mosque long tied to Islamic history. In a few minutes of footage, he delivered a sermon, proclaiming himself the caliph, the successor to the ancient line of Islamic leaders. For many Muslims, this was an insult. But for young people who had been radicalized from Baghdad to Brussels, it was a moment of confirmation. From an anonymous voice on audio tapes, he transformed into the image of a global leader they could actually see. What made this organization dangerous was not only its territory, but the way it operated like a distorted state. They set up a Ministry of Finance to collect taxes on every transaction, a Sharia court to legitimize torture, executions, and the seizure of property. They issued reports, videos, online magazines, recruiting fighters from Europe, North Africa, and Central Asia. United Nations figures show that at its peak, tens of thousands of foreign fighters poured into the areas they controlled. From the perspective of anyone who loves peace, we need to look squarely at this point. Baghdadi did not only inherit al-Qaeda's legacy, he raised it to a new level, turning the model of a secret terrorist organization into an open terrorist state, with a capital, borders, a propaganda system, and a revenue-collecting apparatus. He succeeded, for a short time, in making millions of people live under his flag, and in forcing the whole world to debate a question no one wanted to ask. Was this merely a terrorist group, or already a form of state that we were compelled to destroy at the roots? In any system of international law, the model he built also contains all the elements of a criminal state: seizing territory by force, levying illegal taxes, genocide, slavery, and cross-border terrorism. When talking about the crimes of the Islamic State, what matters is not their slogans or propaganda videos, but the very specific people who had to pay the price for the ambitions of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And one of the darkest stains is the Yazidi people in northern Iraq. In the early hours of August 3, 2014, the gunmen of this organization attacked the Sinjar area, where the Yazidi community had lived for many generations. Within just a few days, according to later investigative reports, thousands of Yazidi men and boys were separated from their families. Many were killed or left in harsh conditions as they fled into the mountains. More than 6,000 women and children were taken away, sorted and placed into a system of organized detention, exploitation, and abuse. In 2016, United Nations bodies and several Western parliaments officially called this genocide. It was no longer collateral damage of war, but a deliberate campaign to wipe out a minority community. In the areas they controlled, such as Mosul or Raqqa, the style of rule marked by Baghdadi was also based on systematic violence. The religious courts they established handed down brutally punitive sentences with archaic and extreme forms of punishment, forcing people to live in constant fear. Public executions took place regularly, were filmed, edited, and disseminated as a kind of content to intimidate the population and recruit new fighters. Images of cultural heritage being smashed, from the Mosul Museum to ancient sites in Syria, show that they did not only attack people, but also attacked the memory and historical identity of an entire region. For women and children, especially the Yazidis, the crimes went even further. This organization even issued internal documents seeking to legitimize the buying and abuse of women as part of a system of enslavement. In the propaganda of Baghdadi and his apparatus, The capture of non-Muslim women as slaves was twisted into a kind of right, justified with religious language. That is an extreme distortion of religious texts to justify what, in any legal system, are war crimes and crimes against humanity. When someone who once defended a theology dissertation uses that very knowledge to legitimize sexual slavery, we are no longer facing a religious leader, but a calculating criminal. But the violence that Baghdadi unleashed did not stop in Iraq and Syria. Under his leadership, this organization directly directed or inspired a series of attacks in the West and many other places. On November 13, 2015, gunmen and suicide bombers attacked multiple locations in Paris, from the Stade de France Stadium to the Bataclan Theater, killing 130 people. On March 26, 2016, bombers linked to this network attacked the airport and a metro station in Brussels, taking more than 30 lives and injuring hundreds. In Turkey, Iraq, and Afghanistan, a series of bombings targeting mosques, markets, weddings, and funerals pushed the death toll into the tens of thousands, turning the most ordinary activities of civilian life into highly risky acts. You and I likely learned of these attacks through breaking news bulletins, notification lines on our phones, and flags flown at half-mast in front of public buildings. But for millions of people in the Middle East, Baghdadi's crimes were what they lived with every day for many years. It was nights spent sleeping to the sound of shelling, mornings stepping out the door not knowing whether their market, school, or place of worship would become the next target. When we put it all together, we do not just see a terrorist organization, but a comprehensive model of violence, where law is replaced by fear, where women and children are turned into property, where the deaths of civilians in Paris, Brussels, or Baghdad are used as marketing messages for a cruel project. That is Baghdadi's most concrete legacy, a legacy that does not lie in the sermons he delivered, but in the mass graves, in the refugee camps, and in communities like the Yazidis, who will need an entire generation to heal if we truly help them. After the peak year of 2014, the so-called Islamic State began to contract. From the end of 2015, the coalition led by the United States, Kurdish forces, the Iraqi army, and the Syrian government forces gradually stripped away the territory that Baghdadi had seized. In July 2017, Mosul was declared liberated after many months of fierce fighting. In October 2017, Raqqa, their de facto capital in Syria, also fell. One by one, each city, each bridge, each oil field was recaptured by the various coalition forces. In December 2017, the Iraqi government declared victory over the Islamic State on its territory. In March 2019, at Baghouz, the last strip of land that this organization held in eastern Syria was also captured by forces led by the Kurds. The state structure that Baghdadi had built was dismantled almost completely in less than 3 years. From a position of controlling millions of people, this organization returned to its original form, a terrorist network with no official borders. But Baghdadi himself was still the shadow looming over everything. He rarely appeared after the sermon in Mosul, mostly emerging through audio recordings calling for continued attacks worldwide. Rumors of his death surfaced and were then denied many times. For many victims, justice had not yet been served, as long as the man who had signed the orders for genocide in Sinjar was still alive somewhere in the desert. In the early hours of October 26, 2019, U.S. time, the President of the United States announced that U.S. Special Operations Forces had carried out a mission in Idlib province, northwestern Syria. The target was Baghdadi's hideout in a compound near the village of Barisha. According to the official account, when cornered in a dead-end tunnel, he detonated a suicide belt killing himself and the children who were with him. A team of military dogs and biometric technology were used to confirm his identity. For many families of the victims, it was a moment mixed with relief and bitterness. From the perspective of many people, it is hard to forget this contrasting image. In 2014, Baghdadi stepped onto the pulpit of the Al-Nuri Mosque in Mosul, wearing a black robe, speaking of a caliphate that would last until the Day of Judgment. In 2019, he died in a dark tunnel, surrounded by broken concrete and rubble, fleeing from the very soldiers he had once called infidels. This was not only the end of an individual, but also a reminder that any project built on slavery and genocide will sooner or later collapse. If we only look at the day he died, October 26, 2019, it is easy to believe that the story of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has closed. But the toxic legacy he left behind did not disappear with the bomb in the tunnel. What he built, from the model of a terrorist state to the way of using social media to turn violence into recruitment content, is still there in the branches loyal to the Islamic State, in Iraq, Syria, Africa, and Afghanistan. Tens of thousands of women and children labeled as fighters' families are still living in detention camps, in conditions that can easily turn into a new kind of Camp Bucca if we abandon them. From the perspective of policymakers in the United States, there is an uncomfortable truth. Baghdadi did not emerge from a vacuum. He is a product of war, of decisions to dissolve an entire state apparatus within a few weeks, of prisons like Abu Ghraib and Camp Bucca, of power vacuums that we and our allies did not fill with justice and hope, but with uncertainty and humiliation. When that void is not filled with schools, jobs, and moderate voices, it will be occupied by people like Baghdadi, those who know how to turn resentment into a weapon. The lesson here is not that it is enough to eliminate the leader and be done. The lesson is that we must look early at the signs of radicalization, must invest seriously in reconstruction, reconciliation, and education, and must cooperate with the very communities that were once his victims, from the Yazidis to the Sunnis, trapped between two lines of fire. Baghdadi is dead, but the question he left us remains intact. Do we have enough courage and patience to address at the root the things that created him, so that the next generation does not have to grow up under a new black flag, replacing the one that was buried in that tunnel? Leave your thoughts about this video right below in the comments section. You may not agree with every analysis, but the very act of daring to ask questions and to debate is already a way of resisting the silence that extremism always exploits. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video if you believe that stories like this need to be told, not to sow fear, but to remind one another that such crimes must never be allowed to become normal.